What are you drinking?
McDonald's coffee because it's way better than Tim Hortons coffee.
Who do you think you are?
Matthew's Gospel was written by Matthew. He's also known as Levi, and he was a tax collector before he started following Jesus. Now, last week we learned that John's Gospel was written for a more Greek audience. Well, Matthew's Gospel is a little bit different in that it was targeted towards a more Jewish audience. And we know this because Matthew makes a lot of references to Jewish history. He makes references to Jewish festivals and other parts of Jewish culture that they would have found extremely valuable and important. Matthew starts his gospel off by listing a long line of genealogies, going all the way from Abraham to Jesus. Now, we as modern readers might not find an importance of that. Like, why should we care that Azar was the father of Zadok? And because of this, we often find ourselves skipping over this part of scripture. But we need to be reminded that Matthew wrote his gospel for first century Jews and Christians, not for us here in Williams Lake in the year 2023. And for Jews and Christians of the first century, genealogies were very, very important. And they were important because they showed them, and it was a reminder that Jesus did in fact come from the line of David, which was prophesied to David in the 2nd Samuel.
Now, when we come to our good question, we find Jesus in the district of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea Philippi was approximately 40 kilometers north of the Sea of Galilee, and it was an important Greco-Roman city with a primarily pagan population. Just before Jesus and his disciples enter the district, we find them in the region of Bethsaida, which we know, courtesy of Mark's Gospel, that we'll go more into in the weeks to come. Mark 8 verses 22 to 25 says, "And they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought to him a blind man, and begged him to touch him. And he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he'd spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked him, 'Do you see anything?' And he looked up and said, 'I see people, but they look like trees, walking.' Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and his eyes were opened, his sight restored, and he could see everything clearly." Now, it's unusual that Jesus chooses to heal somebody twice. And we say chooses because we know he has the authority to do it once. And this passage is not Jesus struggling to heal so much as it is symbolically significant. The man can't see clearly at first, and with Jesus' help, he has his sight fully restored. This is not only indicative of the disciples' lack of understanding fully of who Jesus was, but is also a beautiful image of how we can have our eyes opened as we get to know Jesus further and deepen our understanding of him.
So just like the blind man, people's eyes were starting to become opened to who Jesus was, although they still couldn't quite see who he fully was.
At this point, they knew he must be more than a teacher, so they began to liken him to one of the legendary prophets of their past.
So when we look at some of the verses leading up to our good questions, starting in John chapter 16, verse 13, we read this. When he entered the region of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And they replied, "Some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, others say Jeremiah, or one of the other prophets."
So we know Jesus' popularity has clearly been spreading. Even Herod the Tetrarch has heard about Jesus, and he proclaims to his servants, "Surely that this man must be John the Baptist risen from the dead."
So after Jesus gets this answer about the general population, what their idea of him was, he turns in verse 15 and asks the disciples the same question.
"But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?"
And so we ask you, who is Jesus to you? And why do you believe it?
And if your understanding about who Jesus is wrong and doesn't align with the Bible, are you willing to change your understanding?
And so we encourage you to start praying about this and search your hearts for these deep questions as we come into Sunday morning.
That's good. That's
We got
good.
it. We got it.